Hello and welcome to the 24/7 Sports College Basketball Show. Before we get going, make sure you like, share, and subscribe this 24/7 Sports channel for all the latest in your college basketball recruiting and college football needs. All right, we've got a busy show for you here today. We have got our rankings revealed, the final rankings for the national class of 2024. And then, believe it or not, we're going to tie it into the NBA playoffs. We're going to talk about Anthony Edwards, the former number one ranked prospect in the class of 2019, and what his developmental story says, if anything, about the current state of grassroots basketball. Then, of course, no show would be complete in the spring without an assessment of where we are with the transfer portal, and Isaac Trotter will be doing that with us. All right, without further ado, we are going to get to these rankings. They are going live as we speak at 247sports.com. Here you see the 18 five-star prospects in the class. That's right. We have 18 prospects identified as the very best of the best. Asa Newell, Con Kneppel, Darian Reed, Donnie Freeman, Flory Badunga, Isaiah Evans, Derek Queen, and Drake Powell. That leads us to the top 10, and it begins with Liam McNeely at number 10, Jaden Quaintance at 9, Ian Jackson at 8, Jalil Bethia at 7, Trey Johnson at 6, VJ Edgecombe at 5, Kaman Malawach at 4, Dylan Harper at 3, Ace Bailey at 2, and Cooper Flagg retains his spot as the number one ranked prospect in the class. Now, when we're doing rankings, we are considering two primary variables. That is, number one, who's going to be the best college player next year? Number two, who is the best NBA prospect? Everything else we're trying to keep null and void in our mind. And let's give you a little peek behind the curtain in terms of how we did that. We're going to begin with number 3, Dylan Harper, a player who played his way back into this spot through a terrific series of postseason events, ranging from the McDonald's All-American game all the way to a big-time performance at the Jordan Brand Classic. All right, the first thing you need to know about Dylan Harper is he's got as good a chance as anyone to be the best freshman guard in college basketball next year. He's big, he's strong, he's got long arms, and a terrific natural feel for the game. He's not necessarily a dynamic athlete relative to the highest standards, so his shooting is going to have to develop into a true weapon for him to have the best long-term outcomes. All right, now at number 2, we went with Ace Bailey. But make no mistake about it, Ace Bailey is a prospect who had a very legitimate chance to go number 1, given his rapid ascension in the last year and his overlap of wing size, explosive athleticism, and shot making. He's still got some inefficiencies in his game to figure out and a potentially bigger adjustment to the structure he'll have at Rutgers. But there are very legitimate star outcomes that are possible for him down the road. You even hear Tracy McGrady comparisons. And he, too, is a candidate to go very high in the 2025 NBA draft just 1 year from now. But the number one prospect in the national class of 2024 who has retained this spot since his reclassification over the summer is Cooper Flagg. And simply put, he's the surest thing in the class between his defense, passing, versatility, underrated athleticism, and killer instinct. That's not to say scouts don't have questions, though. They always do. Is he the offensive alpha we saw last summer on the E16 circuit? Does the shooting keep evolving in the right direction? Those are the variables that will determine his ultimate ceiling. But the floor is higher than anyone's, and he is the final number one prospect in the national class of 2024. All right, with that having been said, we are going to bring in Eric Bossi to help me break down some of the other top prospects in this class. So, Boss, welcome into the show here. Now, I want to ask you, because I went through the top 3, but we want to touch on some players that may not be quite necessarily the sure things of Harper, Bailey, and Flagg. But for multiple reasons, they may be guys who just require a little bit more patience. First up is a player at number 7 that you wanted to discuss, and that is Jalil Bethia. You like him, but ultimately you may think he's a boom or bust prospect. Why is that?
Yeah, Bethia, first of all, he's a scorer, right? He's a skilled scorer who can get to 40 in a hurry in a high school game. You and I saw that firsthand at the Hoop Ball Classic during January. He's long, he's quick, he can shoot it from deep, and most importantly, when everything breaks down, he can go and get a bucket off of the dribble. Now, he's also a bit on the lean side. He's a bit loose with the handle at times. He can be a bit streaky with a shot, and even more so, he can kind of let his emotions get the best of him at times. You know, he can let instead of erasing a couple of bad plays, he can kind of let it spiral into a series of bad plays at times. Now, the thing that I shouldn't say is maybe a concern, but that worries me a little bit in the terms of the boom or bust thing is he's heading into a situation at Miami where they're really going through a major overhaul on the roster right now. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to step in and put up really big numbers. Now, we expect a guy ranked in the top 10 nationally to put up big numbers, but it's a fine line, especially when there's still that physical development to make. I think in a best case scenario, he comes in and maybe has a Keontae George type freshman season, which I think is a guy who he's probably a pretty favorable comparison to. So he's got all the tools. It's just going to be a matter of does he have his mental right? Is he ready to come in and carry that much of a burden? But he's certainly a guy who's not going to be afraid to take the big shot.
Yeah, I think the thing that really stands out to me about Bethea is the shooting splits relative to the tough shots he takes, because this is a guy who is not shy offensively. You go back to those EYBL numbers a year ago, and he shot it at an incredibly efficient rate. And usually that means that players are selective, but he took tough shots. So we're talking about one of the best shot makers in the class. But to your point, does he have the maturation, both physically and in terms of his approach to winning, to really get the best out of himself next year at Miami? Time will tell, but he finishes as the number 7 ranked prospect in this class. All right, another player that you wanted to dive into was Jaden Quaintance. He finished inside the top 10 at number 9. He's headed to Arizona State, and he is the highest recruit for that program since 24/7 began its rankings back in 2000. There's a lot of pressure on him, though, with an alleged substantial NIL commitment. What kind of player are they getting in Jaden Quaintance?
Jaden Quaintance was a guy that I think we had some pretty good internal debate on. I would say I probably fall on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of what to expect with him and what his potential is, while there were some of us who were maybe a little bit more worried. The number one thing that stands out is this kid is only 16 years old. And if you look at him, he looks like a guy physically that has been in a college weight room for a couple of years. He's not some scrawny teenager. He's got some defined muscle. He's athletic. He's quick. He's got some of the best hands that you'll ever see. They're just big, strong, massive hands. And he can really run the floor. I think what bogs him down at times is, like so many young big men, he really wants to prove that he can play facing the rim, right? So he'll take some questionable jump shots at times. He'll maybe get a little bit too frisky when it comes to putting the ball on the floor and attacking the rim. But again, we're talking about a guy that is younger than some players even in the class of 2026, and he's going to college as a freshman. He's going to have a couple years to iron things out at Arizona State. I'm going to assume he's going to get a lot of freedom to make things happen with everything it took to get him there. And he's just a guy that I think if people are patient with him and understand that he's not your typical 5-star freshman and he may need a little bit more time because of his youth, the ultimate payoff is astounding to me. And I think he's a guy that long-term could prove to be one of the top 5 prospects in the class.
All right, now the last player I want to ask you about is someone that really looked good in the postseason events. And by that, I mean beginning with the McDonald's All-American game. We know those postseason events are when the NBA scouts come out in full force and really try to get a jump on who these top high school prospects are going into their college years. Donnie Freeman really took advantage of that platform. He moves all the way up into the top 15 in our rankings. He's headed to Syracuse next year. What is it about Freeman, that has allowed him to finish as a top 15 player in the class?
With Donnie Freeman, I think he's a guy that I don't want to say he was necessarily an all-airport team guy all along, but he's a guy that from the very first time we saw him as a freshman, he jumped off the page at you as a prospect because he's got long arms. He's got the size. He's 6'9". He just looks like a power forward prospect is supposed to look. Now he's shown some flashes of the game, but not just in these all-star games, but his senior year at IMG, he's really proven to be a pretty complete player. He's always been a great rim runner, a lob finisher, a versatile defender who could switch out in pick and roll situations and contain a guard for a little bit. But as a senior, he started knocking down threes at a really regular clip. He's added some needed strength. He's learned when and how to attack other big guys off the dribble when facing up. And he's become a consistent threat on the glass. I think he's a guy that, as good as he's gotten over the last year, he's still barely just scratching at the surface of his future potential. And if you look at Syracuse over the years, I think he kind of embodies what we've come to learn from, what we've come to expect from him in these long, athletic, versatile kind of foremen. And he's a guy that's got significant potential. I don't want to say he's a for sure one and done guy right now, but the reality is there'll be 15 to 20 guys that end up being it if the pass is any indication. He's one of those guys who I think is really soaring up the charts quickly, and another really good value play who could end up outplaying his ranking.
All right, now to see the entire class of 2024 national rankings, you can go straight to 247sports.com. We've got 1 through 150, as well as wall-to-wall team coverage, recruiting rankings, transfer and portal updates, 247sports.com. Now, Ebos, speaking of 5 stars, Anthony Edwards, who finished as the #1 overall prospect in the class of 2019, is more than living up to that billing right now. He and his Timberwolves have a 2-0 lead over the defending champion Denver Nuggets in the second round of the NBA playoffs. Ant has rather infamously now claimed that he could star in any sport and even teased a possible NFL career in the future. So I've got to ask you, there's a long-standing conversation in youth sports, not just about basketball, but about the increasing pressure for kids to specialize versus playing multiple sports. Does Ant's story lend any relevant data point or example for people to cite at this point?
I think it can, and he's certainly not the first guy to have a professed love for another sport or play another sport and excel at it coming up. Obviously everyone knows about LeBron James, famously an all-state wide receiver in the state of Ohio. Jalen Suggs of the Orlando Magic was a big-time quarterback in high school. Even Willie Cauley-Stein was an all-state receiver who racked up over 2,000 yards receiving as a senior in high school at 7 feet tall, right? So this isn't unusual. I think what's really most unique about Anthony Edwards, though, is the way he was able to blend both things and his ability to make us believe that if he wanted to play in the NFL, he could do it. And I love that. It's about his confidence, and it's about trying other things. I think that we've seen him and others excel in other sports while still being able to lock in on the thing that's getting them paid. It's important. I think kids growing up trying different things and getting different experiences is a good thing. I think learning how to take a hit playing football like he did doesn't hurt when it comes to driving to the rim and you're trying to finish with Nikola Jokic. And you see, we've shared these highlights of him playing, 10 and 11 under football. Like he's just a monster. Like it's a lot of fun to talk about this thing. But I think the biggest thing with Anthony Edwards that relates to grassroots and, something is that he never got spoiled by the system. What we see today is, and why people gravitate to him, is he's so humble. He's got so much personality, and he had every chance to be spoiled. He had every chance to be kind of a prima donna type with people telling him how great he was. And he never took that. He never took that to the head. He kept what needed to be the main thing. And I think that's the biggest lesson that he offers, is that not all these grassroots kids are spoiled. It's possible to make it through this without being, quote unquote, ruined. And there's still a lot of good about grassroots basketball, even if it's not perfect right now.
And, I want to kind of just touch upon this from a perspective of a parent, which you and I both are. My kids are 12 and 9. My 9-year-old is being asked to specialize right now. And that's something I think is detrimental, not just to him, but I think to all these kids. And I think the stories of Edwards, who's able to play multiple sports, because to your point about getting hit, there's other lessons you can learn, like spatial awareness. And there's just a kinesthetic kind of awareness that comes up. Some people, you hear these stories, a lot of athletes are good at multiple sports because they just develop a practice of picking up different movements and habits quicker than others through trying different things. And I think there's really something there that others have explored in more detail, but I think it's a good point. The other thing I want to ask you about, because in basketball specifically, we talk about this need to specialize, but in basketball specifically, the virtues of the current grassroots landscape have been debated for a long time. Now, I don't want to call it AAU because it's not the Amateur Athletic Union anymore, but lots of people say AAU just to describe current grassroots basketball. You've covered this space longer than anyone in the industry, so I'm curious. What do you say that the narrative that AAU or grassroots basketball, the current state of it, is ruining American basketball?
Frankly, I think it's a kind of lazy take. I think that it's a scapegoat take. Is grassroots perfect? Of course not. And I think we're going to talk about that some, but it's still pretty darn successful if you want to talk about things. It's still producing, by and large, the best players. And I know in the NBA now we're looking at a more global game, right? We've got Giannis, we've got Nikola Jokic, we've got Luka Doncic. We have all these international stars. Now, part of that is great marketing by the NBA to make it a beloved game worldwide. But also, I think what people fail to account is we've broadened our horizons a little bit. 30 years ago, We were ignorant. We didn't think any of these guys from overseas could play right, so we never gave them the chances. We've become a bit more enlightened in our search for the best players and understood that, yeah, not only do these guys belong, they can excel. Now, that doesn't mean that AAU is bad or grassroots, however we want to talk about it. Because I'm going to throw a few numbers at you for a second. So pardon me if I'm looking off camera for a second. There were 26 NBA All-Stars in 2024 NBA game, All-Star game. 23 of them came up playing through the grassroots basketball system, at least from 15U and on. In the Rising Stars game was featured 15 players. 12 of them came up through that. 42 of the top 50 scorers in the NBA came up through that system. 43 of the top 50 table setters, the assist guys, came up through that system. And now, if we're talking about the nitty-gritty about strictly the U.S. basketball, at the U16, U17, and U18 level in FIBA, where the American players are playing against the best of the best from around the world, representing their home countries, USA basketball has amassed a record of 152-2. I'm going to repeat that. 152-2. These are the best players coming out of the grassroots system representing the USA at a youth level. So, yes, there's fixes that can be made to the grassroots system, but I don't think it can be that broken if it's producing these types of numbers.
All right, this is what you call the OG bringing the fire, everybody. Bossi came with his receipts, and he's putting it on record. And let me just preface what I'm about to say with, I wholeheartedly agree with you. But in the interest of an honest discourse, I think it's just relevant for me to point out a couple of things, counterpoint. And again, I do this knowing that I agree with you. On Tuesday, there were 3 finalists announced for the NBA MVP: Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. They were all born, and with the exception of SGA, developed outside this country entirely. The player who looks like the new generational star in the NBA, Victor Wembanyama, #1 pick in last year's draft, he is French. The two of the leading candidates to be the #1 pick in this year's draft are also French. So there are some counterpoints here. And I think you touched on this, and I have my own opinion that I will interject at the end. But what do we attribute this collective ascension to in terms of the rise of these foreign talents?
One, they're good. I think that they've always been good. And to my point a little bit earlier, I think that we as connoisseurs of American basketball who grew up in the good old US of A, I think we were largely ignorant to just how good other players around the world were. When we were getting into the show, the old guys like me will remember the great Oscar Schmidt from Brazil back in the days. If there was that guy in today's game, it would be impossible to imagine him not getting a chance to come over and play in the NBA. In today's game, a guy like Arvydas Sabonis, we would have found a way to get him to the States before he was old and before he'd suffered several injuries, and he was still great once he got here. So I think it's a matter of, one, of course, people internationally have gotten better, and there's certainly a different way of developing those guys that has a lot of merits in terms of a more focus on training than games. I think the skill development side on arts, there's a huge focus on skill development in the States. But just, again, we're allowing these guys, I shouldn't say allowing, but we've opened our eyes to affording these guys more opportunities and not closing the game to just the borders of the United States. And I think with that, everything has kind of gone hand in hand. And again, it's a star-driven league, right? The NBA is a star-driven league. The biggest stars right now, as some of the older stars are starting to filter out, are leaning international. And I think that's a great thing. But we can have improved international play. We can have much better awareness of how good international players and open doors to international players without it meaning that the grassroots system is totally broken and that Americans are falling behind.
So I agree wholeheartedly. And my take here is that I think the rise of the international talent doesn't have to threaten the quality of the American talent. It doesn't have to be an either or proposition. In fact, I think this was a very deliberate strategy by the NBA when you see the amount of resources they've allocated into developing the game worldwide. And we've seen the NBA in many ways be at the forefront in terms of the professional leagues throughout all sports in the United States, really developing their brand internationally. So I think you have to give the NBA credit for this, because the reality is, as you develop stars from other parts of the world, you develop fan followings in those parts of the world as well. And you really generate more interest in your game and ratings and all that equates to. So I think a lot of this is by design and proof that the NBA's international marketing plan is in many ways working and a template for other professional leagues to follow. The last question I want to ask you about, though, because let's end with this. I think that, as we said, a lot of times when you're talking about AAU, and again, I use that just as an oversimplification to know that it's not the Amateur Athletic Union anymore, but a lot of people still use that acronym AAU to describe grassroots basketball. When you're talking about AAU, even if you don't have this polarized take that it's ruining American basketball, I think we can all acknowledge that, yeah, there are some improvements that could be made to any system, regardless of how good it may be. So what tweaks would you make to our current system in the U.S.?
Yeah, so there's several things. I think we've already seen some of them start to handle. I think the AAU or grassroots basketball that the average person thinks about isn't what you actually see when you go into these gyms, especially with what Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, different shoe companies are doing with these leagues, where there's an emphasis on decorum of the coaches. There's an emphasis on, enforcing rules and trying to make as college or even pro-like simulated game as possible. But there could be some change. Our kids probably play too many games on an average weekend. There's really not a need to play more than one game a day over the course of a weekend. I think with the way things are set up in an evaluation process now, everybody gets plenty of time. We have a lot of exposure camps and things of that nature where it's just strictly roll the ball out and play some pickup ball. I think there's room for more instruction in those type of things. And then what I would like to see, and maybe some of the people who run the big teams won't be too happy with me for this, is one of the biggest complaints about summer ball is that these guys hardly ever practice together, which is true because we're talking about guys being pulled over from, 4 or 5 hours apart, sometimes even further, to come in and maybe practice for one day during the week and then do things. Or in the summer, some teams will run some training camps. But I think if we could go back to, I don't want to say total restriction, but let's try and cut down on the distance that some of these guys are going to play for summer teams. And let's try and make them so that they're a little bit more accessible to each other. So maybe there can be a little bit more practice and a little bit of implementation, because I think we've got a lot of outstanding coaches in the grassroots space right now, but they don't have enough time to work with the kids. And also, I think that we need to somehow get the high school coaches back involved in the process a little more, because at the end of the day, they're still the guys who have the most access to these guys. And I think they're in a tough position where if they feel like they coach them too hard, they're going to leave. Or if parents feel like there's not enough talent around them, they're going to leave. We've got to find a way to empower those guys a little bit more, because they are around them the most, and kind of give them more freedom to work with guys without fear of losing them.
All right. So I want to add to that, because I think that oftentimes the narrative, not that you're suggesting it, but you hear people say like, oh, the high school coaches, again, it's this polarized world, right? The high school coaches are good. The AAU coaches are bad. This weekend, I was at 3SSB, and I saw a team that was up 3, perfectly execute. And I mean, perfectly execute, foul up 3. Couldn't have run it better. And I thought to myself, that is a terrific example of how undervalued some of these grassroots coaches are. By the same token, you and I go to a lot of high school games, and I see high school coaches that have no idea what they're doing, that are in many cases just sitting there collecting that extra money to, and I get it, the teachers don't make a whole lot of money. You get an opportunity to add a little stipend to that, you take it. No, I don't begrudge them at all, but I think it's incumbent upon the major players in this, whether it's the NBA, USA Basketball, the sneaker companies, to ensure that the quality of coaching, both in high school and grassroots, reaches a certain competency level, because I think there are very good coaches on all sides. But the reality is there's also some coaches that are not qualified to be doing it. And especially when you have these kids who are in the developmental phases. I don't believe, I'll say this on the record, and this isn't gonna make me many friends. I don't believe that exposure is something that kids should be worried about really early on in the process. When you're in middle school, when you're an underclassman, it should be about growth, development, and competition as a necessity to facilitate some of those things. But coaching has got to be a requisite for those things. There has to be a certain competency that all coaches are required to meet, whether that's in the grassroots world or the high school world. To me, That's one thing that if we had some organization on, and USA Basketball has been trying to do it with their certification program, but I'd like to see whether it's mandated clinics, mandated, like just some mechanism to make sure that there was a certain level of competency and professionalism required of coaches, whether it is in or out of the academic season.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of putting into better words part of what I was trying to say. And along with that too is our parents have got to allow qualified coaches to coach kids, because there's too many coaches that are fearful of coaching kids. And I think that's a big difference maker between the kids here in the States and kids growing up overseas. The kids growing up overseas respect their coaches and understand that this is what we're here for, where that's not always the case here.
Well, that is a whole nother rabbit hole that we will go down another day. But I tell you what, Ibas and I are going to have more on this. You can check out 247sports.com throughout the course of the week. You're now watching the 24/7 Sports channel. If you enjoy this content, please don't forget to like and share this video, as well as subscribe to the channel, 24/7 Sports YouTube channel, for the latest in college basketball and college football. All right, now, listen, it's May. The portal is closed, which means players cannot enter the transfer portal anymore, but there's still a variety of players who are on the boards, who are bringing in Isaac Trotter once again to help us break it all down. Isaac, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, the portal never sleeps. It's mid-May, and there's still a lot of really big names that have big decisions to make, and a lot of really good schools are having some pretty big internal dialogues too, because those boards are constantly changing and adapting as some of the top targets come off the board.
All right, so let's go over some of the ramifications of what we've seen based on what happened in the last week. Because unlike last year, where you could work back channels to get somebody in the portal in June, that's not an option anymore. So you got to figure things out based on who is on the board right now. My first question for you is North Carolina. They missed in their pursuit of a couple of the big men, Cliff Amurier, Jonas Adu. They still need a big. They need to replace Armando Bacot. Where do you think the Tar Heels go from here?
They're in a really interesting spot, because I feel like there's three names that really stand out, but they're all so different. So they have Van Allen Lubin, the transfer out of Vanderbilt. That's an interesting target for them. He's really, really good on the glass. He's a really, really dynamic offensive rebounder. Then you have Ugonna Onyenso out of Kentucky. He's a great rim protector, but you're still trying to figure out what he is offensively. And then it's Coleman Hawkins out of Illinois, who's really going through the NBA draft prospect right now. But if he comes back to school, he's going to command a high dollar number, but he's arguably the most skilled option on the board. He's not necessarily a true five, but he can really shoot it from three. So I'm curious just how Hubert Davis and his staff kind of look at these three big men and what they try to target to pair with Jalen Washington. They still have the Harrison Ingram discussion to play with. If he ends up staying in the NBA draft, that could make them, go after some fours in the portal, and which big pairs well with it. So it's a fascinating dynamic here, because you look at this North Carolina backcourt with RJ Davis, you get Elliot Cadeau, you have, Seth Trimble's coming back. You have a great recruiting class coming in, and you're like, man, this is maybe the best backcourt in college basketball. You add Cade Tyson to that mix. Like, man, that's maybe one of the better shooters in the portal. And it's really about finding the perfect piece to bring this together. And they're kind of working, with their secondary options, because I felt like Cliff Amore and Jonas Adu were those top two options. And now they kind of got to get creative. And if they can hit on it here late in the cycle, I think you could be talking about North Carolina as the best team in the ACC and one of the best teams in the country.
All right, well, sometimes those secondary options work out pretty well. Look no further than Cam Spencer to UConn last year after they missed on Nick Timberlake. So it is about getting that evaluation right. Another team I want to ask you about, Tennessee. They have filled their spot in the middle, but they're still trying to figure out who's going to be the alpha scorer of next year's team. I don't want to say who's the next Dalton Knecht, because that bar is probably too high to reach, but where do you see the Vols going to fill this final spot?
Well, all eyes are on Chaz Lanier right now out of North Florida, and he is terrific. Just one of the best true guards in this cycle. Probably a combo is probably the best way to do it, but he's just wired to score. Can really shoot it from three at a high percentage, finished around the rim at a high percentage, and it's really all about confidence with him. He was not a guy that had a high usage role at North Florida until this year, and kind of carved out a big time piece, and he's playing at a different level right now. So I think Tennessee feels really good about their spot with him. Obviously, Kentucky is certainly in the mix there. Maryland has certainly tried to get in the mix. BYU is another team that's been mentioned. But you just look at the core that Tennessee has. You have Zakai Ziegler back. You have Darlington Darlin Stone-Dubar out of Hofstra. You have Igor Milicic. You have Jordan Gainey. Like, all those guys feel like they tilt towards the offensive end a little bit. And that's with respect to Zakai Ziegler, who's the reigning defensive player of the year. He's a terrific two-way guard. And then you kind of mix in Felix Okpara and Jemai Meshack, who maybe tilt toward the defensive end a little bit. And so if you could potentially put a Chaz Lanier into this place, Cameron Carr, if you want to get Bossi on the horn to talk about Cameron Carr, he'll love him. That's another high upside guy down the line of this rotation. But you add Lanier to kind of this core that Rick Barnes is building, and you feel pretty good about your team, even after you lost Dalton Connect, who's your leading scorer, even after you lost Josiah Jordan-James, even after you lost Jonas Adu and Santiago Vescovi. So yes, there's been a lot of change, but I'm on the verge of being really bullish on Tennessee again if they can get this Chaz Lanier recruitment done, but it won't be easy.
All right, let's keep it in the SEC. Auburn, they're another team that's done a lot of good work. They had some surprising attrition, but they have replaced a lot of firepower. Still need one more piece up front. Where do we think Bruce Pearl and company could go from here?
Yeah, Samford transfer Achor is on campus right now for a visit. He's kind of the top target for this group. And what do we know about Auburn? They're kind of like Noah's Ark. They want to have two of basically everything. And Chaney Johnson is a really solid 4 that they have. But I think Achor would really complement Janai Broom in that front court well and be another 4 that could be an impact piece. We saw him in the tournament against Kansas showcase what he can do off the bounce. He's got a little bit of a, he's not, I wouldn't say a knockdown catch and shoot 3-point guy, but he can make threes on lower volume. But I love him attacking those long closeouts. And you just think about him, if he's your second best rim protector, like that's a really, really good defense, because what Janai Broom can do anchoring the paint. So again, this, like Tennessee, it feels like Auburn is really close to rounding out this roster with Janai Broom coming back. You have Chad Baker-Mazar, you have Denver Jones, who I think is going to be a classic second-year transfer breakout guy to add to Tahad Pettiford. You throw a Chor into that mix, and we're talking about Auburn as like maybe the best team in the SEC. And the SEC is loaded. They've been great in the transfer portal. I think you could throw Auburn in that mix too with the type of roster that they're in the process of putting together. And I think Achor would be a terrific final piece.
When you look at some of the best players still left on the board and you see who they're considering, one of the teams that seems to come up repeatedly is Texas Tech. They are certainly still going big game hunting. Who are some of the players that they are involved with at this point?
Great Osseber, I think, is the most popular name, the Mountain West Player of the Year out of Utah State. I think a lot of people have thought that one was going to be tough to take him away from Danny Sprinkle, but Louisville's done a really good job in that recruitment. And I think Texas Tech is obviously in the mix here too. And then the other big name is Trezarian White out of UNC Wilmington. I love Trezarian White. I think he is the perfect Texas Tech type of player. They have so much shooting with this roster, with how they've had it really shaping up. You know what I mean? Like Kerwin Walton, knockdown shooter. Chance McMillian, just a net shredder from outside. Elijah Hawkins, a little bit of a lower volume guy, but he could shoot it at a high level. Darian Williams, a big time sniper. They need that wing slasher. And we're trying to build a roster with like very little positional overlap. You add a Trezarian White to that mix who, yeah, he's not a phenomenal high volume 3-point shooter, but he can get downhill in a hurry. A ton of his shots come at the rim. He shot at a really, really high clip there. He's had some big games against high major teams last year. He feels like a plug and play fit for them. So yes, Great Ossever is the bigger name. But I think Trezarian White would be a really nice piece because they have some depth in that front court too, especially if they can get fully healthy. They got Federico out of Pitt, who's a proven, veteran big man, and then Devin Cambridge. If he's healthy, he will certainly chip in there as well. They had high hopes for him last year before he went down with a season-ending knee injury.
All right, now the last team I want to ask you about is Cincinnati, who's really trying to get it right in the portal this year. We've seen Wes Miller make consistent strides in his time with that program, but what do they need to do to take it to the next level?
Yeah, they have one open scholarship left, and they're going big game hunting. And Dylan Mitchell out of Texas is the addition that they're really looking at right now. They have him on campus for a visit. And man, you start talking about what a front court of Aziz Badego and Dylan Mitchell would look like together, and it can be really, really fun. Both of those guys are just jump out of the gym type of prospects who can really protect the rim. You think defensively, those two guys together could be terrific. And, Mitchell has not showcased that he's a big time 3-point shooter, but I think he learned last year at Texas just what his strengths are and how he needs to play. I thought his cutting was really good. I thought his activity level on the glass was excellent last year. And this is a Cincinnati team, like everybody talks in the Big 12, like, oh, wow, like look at what Kansas has done. Look at what Houston has done. Look at Iowa State. You think Baylor, what they've done loading up with Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier, oh, let's look at Arizona. That's going to be a really good team. If you're looking for a dark horse in the Big 12, I think it's Cincinnati because they have made some big-time moves. You throw Dylan Mitchell into this mix, like I said with Bodego, with that young backcourt, Dede Thomas is terrific. They have Simas Lukosius. Daniel Skillings is a guy that I thought really played at a high level at times last year in Big 12 play. It's a deep team. And there's a chance for Wes Miller to make some serious noise in the second year in the Big 12 if they're able to get Mitchell on board.
All right, Isaac, as always, you are on top of all of the information. We appreciate you joining us here on the show. And everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this show. One more time, the class of 2024 final rankings, they are now live at 247sports.com. Of course, you can find the latest in the transfer portal as well as those national rankings. We've got everything covered there, 247sports.com. And you are watching the 24/7 Sports channel and college basketball weekly show. We will see you again next week.